It is 1:02 here on the East Coast. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Orly Berloff from Prevail, and welcome to CMMC 2.0's impact on SMBs. This will be an important discussion and one that will be of interest to many. So thank you for joining us today. Today's discussion will bring together important voices from Redspin, which is one of only 5 certified C3PAOs in the country, and Prevail. Allow me to introduce today's speakers. First, I have Robert Teague from Redspin, a company which has performed thousands of vulnerability assessments and penetration tests and is a thought leader in IT cybersecurity. Robert is a security and assessment consultant services manager, certified CMMC Provisional Assessor, and registered practitioner. He has over 30 years of operational and strategic leadership experience in information technology and cybersecurity operations in the U.S. Army. Second, allow me to introduce Dr. Thomas Graham, Robert's colleague over at Redspin. Dr. Thomas Graham serves as the CISO for Synergistic, which Redspin is a division of. Thomas is responsible for all internal security items for Synergistic, Redspin, and Backbone. Thomas is the chief architect of Redspin, which, as we've noted, was the first authorized CMMC C3PAO. He holds an MBA, MS, and PhD in informational assurance. And last but not least, allow me to introduce my friend and colleague, Greg LaRoche. Greg is the VP of Product Management at Prevail. He has held numerous SaaS product leadership roles across cybersecurity and identity management solutions. With that, I turn it over to Greg. And Greg, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Orly. And thank everyone for spending some time with us today. We have a good program, I think, and I'll run through the agenda quickly before I hand off to our first presenter. So first, we're going to start off with Thomas. He's going to talk to us about a summary of the CMMC 2.0 changes, his interpretation of them, a little color around those changes and what they mean. That's going to be followed with a segment from Robert, who's going to talk a lot about advice and experience and how that applies, especially for a smaller mid-sized business who is faced with meeting the CMMC 2.0 requirements. And then I'm going to wrap up last with a vendor's perspective, what I would call some practical advice on getting started with your CMMC 2.0 journey. And then our goal is to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, because a lot of questions will come in, and feel free to enter them through the Q&A button on your viewer, and we will get it to as many as we can. And so hopefully we'll leave some adequate time for that. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand off to Thomas.
Thanks, Greg. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, potentially good evening, wherever you may be. So with the announcement of CMMC 2.0, naturally there was changes, and those changes have made quite a bit of impact to the CMMC model. The first major change to the model is that all the maturity requirements have been removed from the assessment. What that means is, if you look in the old level 3 assessment guide, all of the items, the 997, 998, and 999s relating to maturity of those items have been removed. It doesn't remove the documentation requirements that you still have. It's just being able to attest to the maturity of those documents aren't there anymore. Additionally, CMMC 2.0 removed the CMMC specific requirements that were added in over and above NIST 800-171. Those are primarily around the asset management domain and situational awareness domains. So once the new assessment guides come out, you'll notice that those aren't there anymore. The other big change is that level 1s are now completely self-assessment, self-attestation. What that means is that in the old model, level 1 still had to go through a third-party assessment, and that's not the case anymore under 2.0. what you'll be required to do is go in and self-attest to a specific amount of controls, and that'll be what you have to do to reach level 1. The new level 2 is what level 3 used to be. And the reason being is that on the original model, you had levels 1 through 5 with 2 and 4 not having truly any type of certification. It was just a stepping stone to the next level. Well, now that's been simplified to levels 1, 3, and 5. And level 2 is now where the C3PAOs come into play. This is due to CUI being assessed at level 3 on the tenets of CMMC 2.0. And before you ask, no, the assessment guides aren't out yet. The assessment guides right now, from what we've been told, should be coming hopefully by the end of November. That's the timetable the DoD is working with to try and get them out to everyone. The other part of level 2 that is new is that there's a split. Some level 2 organizations will be able to self-attest with the senior officer in the organization being able to sign off on the self-attestation. What the delineation is in the organizations that will be able to self-assess versus get third-party assessed has not been specifically identified yet. The thought process that's been provided to us is that, well, if it's not dealing with something such as weapon system or some type of defense capability, then you would be able to self-assess. But again, the specifics on that have not been identified yet, and we're hoping that that will be part of the release come the end of November. Those are some of the biggest differences with 2.0. The other level, level 3, that is the old level 5 and is only a DIBCAC right now assessment. However, be advised that to get a level 3 assessment, which some organizations will have to do, you first have to pass a level 2 assessment before you get into level 3. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that was out there originally, and for that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Prevail, for having us again. Thomas went over a great synopsis of the changes. So first, let me get into some of the misconceptions. Thomas kind of led us into that already. So the first misconception was if you were going for a level 3, you could bypass level 2 and just have the government do it for free. That is not the case. We are being told that everybody that's going for a level 3 must work through the C3PAOs to do a level 2. And then the DIBCAC will come back and do a Delta assessment on the 800, 172 differences. So what does that mean for you? You still have to go through a level 2. For those organizations that are seeking level 2, it's the same process as what the level 3 was. There are misconceptions that they won't have to do an assessment until the DFARS regulations come out, which is anywhere from 9 months to 24 months from now. The reality is we're being told that by the end of November, we should have the new guidelines. And then by January, we should be able to start the assessment process for those that still wish to continue. Those are pretty much the big misconceptions that we've been hearing right now. So some of the things that you should probably look forward to doing or plans to do for the next few steps here. One is if you know that for a fact the CUI data you contain is something that is dealing with the weapon systems, aircraft, something that's pretty sensitive. You don't want to wait. You want to log in with the C3PAOs, pick which ones you want to go with, and get your assessment on the schedule now because it's going to start getting booked up. The longer you wait, the more jeopardy you place yourself in bidding on contracts where the CMMC language will be in it. Again, that's not going to be for 2 years, up to 2 years, but it's still coming. It's not going away. The other thing that you can do is, since the 20 controls have been pulled out of the CMMC 2.0, it really goes back to a NIST 800-171. Some of the things that we don't know is Appendix E coming into play. They have not said yet. And I believe that was one of the questions that was posed earlier. Also, if you look at 800-171, 800-171 Alpha is the assessment guide for doing the NIST 800-171 risk assessment. In there, as Thomas mentioned, you still have to do your documentation as far as policies and procedures. So that is not going away. There's a misconception that since they strip the maturity models out of there, that you won't have to do the policies and procedures, but you still have to. Other than that, I can tell you that most of the organizations that have signed on with Redspin are moving forward. They do not want to take the chance of, them finishing the DoD finishing the DFARS regulations ahead of schedule, and then they start putting the language in the contracts, and then they'll be behind the power curve in bidding on those contracts. So they're moving forward as scheduled. That is probably the best recommendation I can give any organization out here that is looking to move forward. Okay. Other than that, we will move to your questions, and I'll pass it off to Greg to kind of lead us through it. But we have a list that Orly sent us of some questions that are already posted, and I see Linda has posted one. So I guess I'll start with hers. Don't know if the numbering is going to go back to NIST 800-171 or not. It may still be the CMMC numbering system. We'll know more when the guides come out at the end of November. We internally at Redspin have already done a cross-reference and put the NIST 800 numbering to the actual control of the CMMC. So with that, Greg.
Yeah, let me jump in. I had a few remarks to make before we get to questions, and so I'll run through those. My goal here is to just provide some practical advice. You guys have now heard a lot about the changes and what they mean and how we can interpret them. You've heard the common, misconceptions and some advice on, not stopping. But I'll just tell you a few more things from the vendor perspective. First of all, DIB companies should know that they can meet the NIST 800-171 requirements. They've been around for a long time. They're well-defined and well understood, and you can get there. And so the overall goal of this program is protecting the data, the information in the supply chain from being, compromised or otherwise stolen by our adversaries. That's one of the reasons why we've heard earlier that not all your controls are going to be able to be put into a POAM, right? They're going to decide which ones are the most critical and must be done as part of your initial implementation of 171 program. And then, some of the lesser items can be POAM'd and then covered over time. Again, even the POAM itself is going to be time limited if the guidance we're getting so far is that's going to be 180 days. So it's important that you use existing tools and documentation in a way that fits your business. So I know we have companies of all sizes out there, and they've been struggling with, how do I get there? I don't have a compliance officer on my team. What do I do? So, the important thing is that there is help out there. There's advice and consulting services available. Some of it is, available online, but there's a lot of vendors out there that are waiting to help and can jump in and help you get there. Technology is part of the solution. So, definitely think about how the right technology choices can cover a lot of these controls and can boost your SPRS score very rapidly. And it won't be the whole thing, right? You have to have a whole program, and there are 110 controls, and they will need to be addressed. But again, the key is protecting the data. So, choose options that fit, whether it's a, cloud-oriented service, whether it's an in-house or outsourced project. Combine the technology decision you make with documentation and expertise. Take advantage of documentation and advice that the vendor can provide. Just for anecdote, Prevail has for customers a system security plan template, a customer responsibility matrix, sample policy templates, a whole bunch of documentation that can help you get a leg up on your program. which is, a good thing to have as part of, as you flesh out and document all your controls, right? So the other thing to consider is retaining your existing IT investments. We have shown and we've proven that you don't need to rip and replace all your IT investments to get here. You can add things into your existing programs, creating enclaves or segments of your organization that can handle these higher level requirements, especially if you're going to have to handle CUI. So, with that, I'll close off with just one proof point. I'll tell you a little story about one of our customers that recently over the summer underwent a DIBCAC high assessment under 800-171. So this was part of the DCMA's regular auditing capabilities. It's been around for a long time. Vendors get audited. And so, this was a full team audit, DIBCAC team on site for 5 days. They did a documentation review, then they did interviews against the controls, and then they did evidence collection against the controls. So this was a mid-sized company, as fewer than 100 employees, but not a Soho or very small shop, but a kind of a small mid-sized company that did a mix of DoD and commercial business. So they were interested in creating an environment that included Prevail, but also allowed them to keep using their Microsoft 365 commercial investments for their non-controlled business. So the commercial part of their business could stay commercial, and they created a CUI enclave for sharing and securing their messages and files. And of course, our tech was part of that. The good news is, after all the review and after the DIBCAC assessment, this vendor scored 109 out of 110, which is near perfect. So that's we should take encouragement for that this is possible. These controls can be implemented by a mid-sized company. You can get a near perfect score if you do the right things. And the closing thing is, this company is ready to pass a CMMC level 2 assessment now. They're right at the doorstep. So the program, it's almost like DIBCAC did a pre-assessment for them and set them up for their CMMC 2.0 requirement. And so that's a positive thing as well. All right, so I'll wrap with that, and then let's look at some questions. So we have some coming in from our attendees. We also have some that folks sent in ahead of the webcast when they registered. So we'll try to go through and take a combination of those questions. A lot of them have to do with small companies. So we're getting a lot of questions that, various angles around, what do we do? We're a small company. How would we approach this any differently than like a large company that has a lot of resources and staff? So I'll hand that to Robert and see if you guys can have some advice, like specific to the smaller business.
Yeah, so smaller businesses, again, set aside the bifurcation of the level 2, because some that are handling CUI data that isn't considered important can self-assess, right? For the ones that do, you're going to have to go through the C3PAO, and that's an expense you can't avoid, but I do believe you can recoup in the contract when you win the bid. To prep, right? Most of what we're talking about in prepping, if you look at NIST 800-171, a lot of it is documentation. It's the policies and the procedures. Some of it is dealing with the technology, with the devices, making sure that folks have access to only the data they need access to, for example, and things like that. So most of it is actually attainable, as Greg said. So, when you look at it in that aspect, the real, price that you're going to incur is the price with the C3PAO. And again, you can recoup that. But the other preparations are nothing outside the normal of what any company should be doing to safeguard their network. Thomas, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, you kind of hit it on the head. The bottom line is, honestly, there's no one correct way to do it. It's all going to matter on your own environment, how you're scoping, what you're wanting to be assessed. It could, whether you're a large company that has locations all the US, or, you know, you're a small one-man shop. I mean, it all depends on how you're doing that. And from there, once you have that blueprint in place, then you can start addressing some of the other items.
Great. A number of questions, again, touch on the topic of levels. So maybe if we could just spend a couple of minutes, Thomas, start us off, please, on how do I know whether I need a level 1 or a level 2? How do I, you know, where do I figure that out, and how do I figure that out?
So ultimately, once the language starts getting into the contracts, it should be specified in the contract what level of CMMC you have to attest to. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, there's no hard and fast delineation right now. We're hoping that that's going to come with the new CAP documentation, the CMMC assessment process documentation that Rob and I mentioned earlier. The DoD has said they're going to release it the end of November. I'm crossing my fingers and also crossing my toes here that you can't see, hoping they actually meet that deadline, because we have the same question you do. The ballpark, or, you know, kind of the thought process behind it is level 1 is just FCI data, federal contract information. I know organizations I've talked to, they're like, well, we're a sub to a prime. The prime may be handling CUI, but we're not. Should we do level 1, level 2? Well, hopefully your prime will give you some insight into that. But at the end of the day, it depends upon what classification data you're accessing in your housing, determines what level you need to do. For level 2, I believe, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when we were talking to the DoD, they said the thought process around the bifurcation of whether it has to be self-assessed or third-party assessed is, if you're a manufacturing firm and you're making uniforms, well, you may not need to go through a third party. But if you're working on cyber defense, or if you're working on weapon systems, then yes, you're absolutely going to have to get third party assessed. Is that what you remember as well?
Yes, sir. Also, I just want to point out, remember, with the level 1 and the level 2, for those that self-assess, you're now going to have your senior officer, as Thomas pointed out, that has to sign off on that. So there is some kind of ramifications if you're not following the practices that you say you are. So keep that in mind. And remember, everything that's in NIST 800-171 is industry, you know, standards, if you will. It's industry best practices. So you should be striving to achieve those anyway to protect your environment. Again, how much you implement, and as Thomas said, the size of your organization is going to make a difference on how much it's going to cost you. If you don't have the resources of personnel, for example, to set up any of the device configurations, then you're going to have to seek assistance from organizations that provide remediation services and other things, to include a consulting to get you through the process. So anytime you do that, you're adding funds to the process.
Great, thanks. Also got a number of questions. Companies looking for advice that aren't currently under contract with a DoD agency or buyer, and they're thinking, well, what do we do? How are we supposed to be ready if we get a future DoD contract, or if a prime wants us to bid on something? What should we be doing now? I think that's a great question for the companies that are in that spot.
So with regards to that unknown, that ambiguity, if your plan is to eventually either bid directly on or partner with another organization that is going to handle CUI, definitely start looking at the requirements now. Don't wait, 10 months down the road, 12 months down the road, because once you do, and once those requirements get added into the contract, it's too late. Most of the requirements, keep in mind, are still in place. Yes, now with CMMC 2.0, you have the capability of a POAM. However, POAM isn't, your get out jail free card. It's more like I would like to liken it to your bail bondsman. You know, it gives you a certain amount of time to address items. And I believe the last indication we got from the DoD was any items that weren't deemed critical in nature. So you do have that option now, but for those organizations that are looking potentially to get into this, don't wait. You know, start talking with your senior officers, start talking with your business leaders, and figuring out what type of contracts you first want to bid on. If that's going to include weapons, cyber defense, or any of those items that are more critical in nature for CUI, start making plans to attest to CMMC 2, level 2, sorry. If you're just going to bid, again, the example that was given to us was, you know, uniform manufacturing or something of that nature. Well, you may not need, you know, the third party, but you're still going to have to attest to it. And at the end of the day, yes, the contract should specify it, but if you're unsure on what those informational requirements are, DoD actually has the DoD-CUI.mil website, and go through there and see if what you're actually working with now would match any of those categories. Rob, did I miss anything?
No, spot on. I would like to add, you know, that personally, I'm not a betting man, and I've always prepared for the worst and then hope for the best. And that's really the thought process you need moving forward. The organizations that are, you know, the 80%, 60% or higher that deal solely with DoD contracts, they are not waiting. They are moving forward. They're not hesitating at all because that's their livelihood. For those that haven't got into it yet, I would still, as Thomas said, don't wait, because you still have to self-attest. And when you self-attest, that means you're saying you're doing what you're doing. So regardless of whether you self-attest or Redspin comes out or another C3PAO, you still have to meet the controls of 800-171. The more you start planning now, the better off you're going to be. A lot of the organizations we're working with now have started this process a year, 2 years ago, and they are ready, and they're not waiting. So as soon as we get the green light in June or July, or January, dates are all messed up, too many J's, they're ready to go. So we're hoping those come out. We are being flexible because, you know, November and December are big holiday months. So that may slow down some of the DoD work. But we are anticipating in January, we can move forward with the assessments, and they are not hesitating. So I suggest you not hesitate as well.
Yeah, that was good. We did get a number of questions related to timing. So I think you've just covered a good amount of that. I would just pick on one more thing. We're waiting for the new assessment guidance, like the documentation. And as you say, you know, as things proceed, maybe as we might predict or guess, when can assessments start? You know, just anything more you could say on the timing, because there's so many questions on people saying, well, when is this stuff going to happen? And when are some of these open questions going to be answered? Like which items can be POAM'd and which ones can't? And so there's a lot of uncertainty still in a couple of areas of CMMC 2.0.
Yeah, but it's still a great question, Greg. So for anybody, you know, just using Redspin as an example, we're an authorized RPO, C3PAO, as well as an LTP. So we cover training, we cover the assessments, and we can assist you with consulting. If we assist you with consulting, we cannot do your assessment, and vice versa. But the timeline they've given us, again, at the end of November, we're supposed to get the new assessment guides, which will address a lot of the questions of, does Appendix E come into play? Is 800-171 alpha still in play? Those guides will address those questions. Then they've anticipated, and they've relayed to us that by January, we should be able to continue with the assessments. Having said that, that means they are still moving forward with DIBCAC, working with C3PAOs to get them certified. We're still moving forward with training. The CCP course is out there now. Folks can take them. We ourselves at Redspin are waiting to see what the new course requirements are before we begin training again. And they're doing the certified assessors as well. So those are not going away. The C3PAOs aren't going away. They're still trying to build that marketplace so everybody has a little more choice on who they go with. And not only that, it just alleviates a lot of the backlog that's going to take place, because right now there's only 5 of us C3PAOs to do assessments, and already Redspin is booked in quarters 1 and 2. So if that gives you an idea, you know, and that's anticipating that we go in January to begin the assessments. We're still booked. The longer it takes for them to tell us that, yes, you're ready to go start doing them, the more that can shifts right, and we move into quarters 2 and 3. So keep that in mind as you're contemplating this.
Excellent. We haven't said much about, we've talked a lot about self-assessment, but we haven't really talked anything about, you know, the DFARS requirement for, you know, SPRS attestation. And the fact that one of the changes that we're hearing in the guidance is that an executive is going to have to sign off on that score. Can you guys comment a little bit about how does that change things? And do you think that's going to drive companies to look at pre-assessment or some kind of third-party validation before they submit their score? Or what are your opinions on that?
Well, I would like to start off, Greg, with used to when I was an IAO for DISA several years ago, the ISM I worked with, I asked him one time what, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, what is the purpose of my job? And he said, the purpose of your job is to make sure I don't wind up on C-SPAN at 2 o'clock in the morning going, no, Senator, I don't remember that IA control. The reason why I tell that story is that this is that similar requirement, because now if you're self-assessing, that CEO, that president, that principal, you know, whoever the senior official is in your organization, now that they have to sign off on it, that is their attestation that they are responsible for the data that is being held by the organization. And if a breach happens or an incident happens, there is that potential that now that senior official will be held responsible. Will they have to testify before Congress? I don't know. I'm not DOD, and I'm not a congressional, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night. But ultimately, that puts the responsibility on that shoulders, because within the business world, the CEO is ultimately responsible for all of the business decisions of the organization. That now includes the CUI data. So once they sign it, guess what? They're the ones that are ultimately responsible to the DOD for ensuring the data is not only secure, but you're maintaining that level of security and assurance to be able to handle and process that data.
Yeah, so this is nothing different from, you know, any of the industry certifications you go for. They mentioned this in CISP, they mentioned it in the CISM certifications, that the senior official is responsible ultimately for the network and what happens on that network. One of the biggest keys or plays that come in here is that whenever there's a breach or a leak of data, it's still reportable. It's that control is still in 800-171. So you still must report. Where it comes into play is the False Claims Act. That's where they're going to come after you, at least the DOD, and hold you accountable. In my experience, you know, working as a consultant coming through Synergistic, who is focused mostly in the healthcare industry, but that's not the only place. The reality is a network is a network. So, you know, Synergistic works with banks, they work with grocery stores, you know, you name it, anywhere that's got a network kind of seeks Synergistic as one of the risk assessment folks. It's been in my experience with a lot of them that the CIOs, when they develop policies, it's typically the CIO or the CISO that signs off on it, because the executives want they don't want their signature on anything. So it's a typical struggle internally to get the executives to sign off on policies and stuff like that. That changes with the CMMC 2.0. Your executive must sign off, and you're now going to be held accountable via the False Claims Act.
Important stuff. So great. So we We're getting close towards our 45-minute target, but we still have time left for a few more questions. I'm going to ask our panelists to maybe pick off any questions that I haven't asked you that you wanted to address. Give you an opportunity to call those out yourself.
Sure. It is a question from David McAllister. So is it recommended to create an enclave to handle your CUI? Yes, most definitely. Why? Some of the organizations we work with, they have a civilian side of the house and they have, you know, the DoD side of the house. In order to function, they want to keep those separated, right? It's about segmentation. The best way to do that is to create a secure enclave and just store your CUI data there. Any controls you put for the CUI enclave can also be placed on the civilian side of your network. It's only going to do, all it's going to do is help protect it. But this keeps it separated, number one. That way, if there is some kind of leak, it's contained in this environment. The other thing that it does for you is it draws down that scope when you have to be assessed, right? So rather than looking at your entire network, we're only looking at a little piece of it. And as Greg mentioned earlier, you know, cloud service and other kinds of folks like Prevail can assist you in doing that. And I highly recommend that you do that. That's what we did at Redspin. We had to keep it separate from our parent company, Synergistic, and only a few people have access to it. And that's it. Thomas?
No, I definitely agree with you. But the other part that I'll add in there is that if you do it this way, from a business rationale, you're giving yourself more scalability. So that way, you know, if you bring more folks on board or, you know, even if you downsize at any particular point in time, the scalability is simply, you know, spinning up access to that virtual environment. It's, you know, you're not having to address, you know, physical systems that are on-prem. All of that is handled by the third party. But, you know, just looking at some of the other questions, Michael and Matt, I know early on you asked about specifically the controls, you know, if Michael, if you don't currently handle CUI, you're unsure if you're going to be handling CUI, you know, should we be addressing that? Honestly, as a security guy at heart, I'm going to play devil's advocate because, as Rob mentioned, our parent organization, Synergistic, we've dealt with healthcare for a long time, and the notion is not if, but when. You know, for instance, our parent organization, we don't hold, process, maintain, or transmit any type of EPHI. But if the off chance comes that we do have those occurrences to where somebody inadvertently sends it to us, or we see it in one of the organizations we're working with, we still have to have those policies and procedures in place to address what happens. So for CUI, guess what? Your incident response and your data handling items should address that. Regarding the vulnerabilities, Matt, which kind of ties into what Michael is saying, or Michael's question. Vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities. If you want to maintain two separate POAMs with two separate requirements, you can. However, my personal opinion, and that's all it is, this isn't direction from the DoD, is why would you? Why wouldn't you benchmark your vulnerability requirements across your organization? Because that lessens the level of effort that the folks that you have addressing those and working on those have to do, because if they know that there's a singular time requirement as opposed to two different ones, three different ones, different levels of criticality and whatnot, it's going to be an easier management aspect for organizations. So for instance, for Redspin, when we started looking at this, we said, okay, you know, what's our requirements? Well, last I knew, DoD's requirements on highs and criticals were 21 days. So when we started down this road, we benchmarked that across our entire organization, saying for any highs or criticals, we're going to benchmark at 21 days or less to be able to meet that. And when we went through DIBCAC, that was a very easy way to show, because we were able to show them where we were tracking it, where we've addressed it. Even during the assessment, new vulnerabilities popped up, and we were able to show where we'd addressed it during the scope of that assessment. Because keep in mind, we went through during CMMC 1 and we had to show that maturity. Rob, anything else you wanted to add to that?
On my unmute button. No, you hit it all on the head. I was going to actually move into a question somebody just asked about where does the executive sign? When we're talking about the executives taking responsibility, that's signing the policies, right? And then how do you guys self-attest? That is something we're waiting on clarification as well. As you know, it was the SPRS, right? Where you would go and put your self-assessment up there before. Now we don't know if it's going to be a direct line, to the CMMC AB where you have to self-assess to them. So we're still unsure of that. But when we're talking about executives signing off, it's on the policies, and then they have to sign off on the self-assessment. However, that's going to be delivered. The other question I wanted to get to was one that was answered or asked earlier today, and it involves where'd it go? Everything kind of shifted around. It was a question from Michael that it's not just CMMC that they have to meet certifications for, but they have other requirements as well. And we just went over this with one of our clients in a meeting the other day. They have, there's other different types, ITAR. I mean, you pick what other certifications are out there. And the big question is, if you do CMMC 2.0 and you get certified, do you still have to do those others? That is a question we are going to pose to the DoD because it hasn't been addressed, honestly. So, and it is a great question, because if they're following everything with CMMC 2.0, it should alleviate anything else that's out there. Should, but that's not always the case. So we want to get clarity for those that have to attest to more than just one framework. Okay.
And just looking at some more specific questions real quick, Orly, but before we stop, I know several of you have asked around costs and stuff of that nature. One, as we mentioned at the beginning, the cost, it really depends upon the scope of your environment and what's being entailed. The best advice I can give you is to reach out to one of the C3PAOs and have that discussion. As far as implementation for any of the CMMC items, I know Nicholas was asking about a SEAM. That's something we actually dealt with ourselves, and the questions we asked ourselves. And the answer to your question, Nicholas, is that yes, you can do this without implementing a SEAM, because the requirement is really about log correlation and aggregation. Can you do that manually? Yes. I will tell you from somebody that has done that in the past, though, it is a very labor intensive and very grueling process, especially if you don't have some capability to identify different alerts or anything like that. And what I would ask you is that when you're looking at going without a SEAM, think about all the different services that you may use in your organization. How are you going to be able to pull logs in from all of those, whatever, whether it be weekly, monthly, day, whatever, and then still correlate those across however many users that you have. It is really a grueling process and not something I would wish on anybody.
But that's the reason Thomas's hair is receding and mine is turning gray, because we've been in the logging and you don't want to do it manually. So yeah, if you can institute a SIM, then yeah, by all means do so. They have open market SIMs that you can use that don't cost you anything. You can leverage those, but that is very hard. And you definitely want the correlation going on. So with that, I think we pretty much run the gamut, Orly. So.
I would think so, but I just realized we do have a few minutes left, and just to give a great audience an opportunity to ask any more questions, I just wanted to open up to a little bit of live Q&A. So the way that'll work, everyone has a little hand, looks like this, on the bottom of their screen. So if you raise your hand, I will call on you, kind of like in grade school, and open your mic. You can ask your question, just make sure you present it, say who you're going to ask the question to, and you'll get answered live. All right. First person raising their hand is Matt Curie. So Matt, they allow you to talk. Please go ahead and ask your question. Matt, please unmute yourself.
There we go. My question is really, with CUI vulnerabilities, do they need to be separate from non-CUI vulnerabilities? If you have one vulnerability program for your network, and part of that is CUI, does that need to be separate from the non-CUI vulnerabilities? Does it need to be a separate program or just all one program?
It doesn't need to be a separate program, and honestly, what it boils down to, Matt, is your level of criticality. Because if you have a vulnerability on a quote unquote more sensitive system, one that handles CUI, then the criticality or the risk factor on exploit of that is probably greater in your organization. So what you can do is, and this is just my advice, what you could potentially do is within your tracking metrics, you could identify those assets as CUI related, but still have it inclusive of your overall program. I know, just as ourselves, I track all of that in one program, whether it's our organizational assets, whether it's our assets that are handling CUI. One of the things that I implemented was adhering to the same requirements across the board. If it's affecting one of our CUI systems, or if it's affecting Rob's laptop that he's working on now, it's the same requirements. We didn't have to show, separate items with regards to it. What it boiled down to was, do we have a standard? Are we following our own standard? And if we aren't following our own standard, why are we not following it? So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, and Matt, that was a great question, and thanks for that. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. Sorry if we couldn't get to them all, but
Yeah, one or two more very quickly.
yeah, I do. Yeah, I really real quick want to point out something that Thomas just kind of highlighted on. Notice that asset management was removed from CMMC 2.0. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Thomas does it. He's got every one of our laptops that are marked sensitive. He's tracking those along with every device that touches the synergistic and Redspin networks. So it's just good practice to keep doing that. All
right. So we have just two more questions, and then I think we'll call it a day. Next question is from Greg Letourneau. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Greg, I'm unmuting you. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thanks for taking the question. I submitted one in writing, but I just want to follow up on this since it again didn't get answered. So we set up an enclave using Prevail probably almost a year ago, and we've got our SSP and SIPRs. But my problem with this is in establishing a realistic or a true scope of our environment. And the problem that I have is we can store all the CUI data when it's at rest, and we can process it through the Prevail enclave. But the way the government works, if they send out an RFP that's got CUI in it, for example, they won't send it to us individually, and they can't send it encrypted to a group of people at the same time. So they'll send it to a third-party site like DoD Safe. And so we'll log on to Safe with our CAC. But there's always this instance where you have for a moment, you've got this CUI file or file that contains CUI on your corporate laptop before it gets into Prevail. Or if I get an email through Prevail, through Outlook, it's still transiting through my laptop. So from an assessment standpoint, how do they look at the laptop and what type of protections the laptop has to be? Do we have to include all of our corporate laptops or anybody that's using Prevail into the scope of that enclave?
You want me to take a swing at that? Because we get this one a lot. So, there's a lot of layers to this. And of course, your mileage may vary based on your specific network layout and topology and all that good stuff. But I can generalize a little bit. And in general, if you're bringing information in from, say, a DoD portal that has to be handled under your CUI program, then you're going to have a policy and procedure on the edge where that information, like you say, it's getting onto a company device, and then it's making its way into Prevail in your case. So there's a policy and a procedure for that describes that. I would say, my opinion is, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, that device is now in scope, right? So you have to have the proper endpoint controls on that device. It has to be part of your monitoring program, has to have hard drive encryption and whatever other controls you want to put on it to make it compliant. It's either that or you have to, designate a virtual device that makes that connection, like a VDI that's managed and configured to be compliant. There's a couple different ways to do it, but in general, I would say, yeah, that endpoint is in scope. You guys agree with that?
You nailed it,
colleagues.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's why we try to do as much from inside the enclave as possible. Even if that's accessing something else, we don't do it from outside there. We try our best not to. So yeah.
And I can tell you from going through the DIBCAC assessment, even though, yes, we have virtual implementation with how we stood it up. However, we still had to show not only metrics, because again, we went through 1.0, but also the processes, the procedures, the protocols, and the technical items that we have in place on the physical laptops as well. And that's the, just in case that you mentioned, what if we wanted to show that, we're still monitoring those types of assets.
All right, Greg Latorno, thank you for your question. We have one last one from Yasmin, who I noticed had posted a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I want to give Yasmin just a quick opportunity to ask the question. All right, Yasmin, please unmute yourself.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yasmin Tajday with National Defense Magazine. I know one criticism of the original CMMC was that it posed hurdles to small businesses, to mid-sized businesses. Do you think CMMC 2.0 successfully eliminates those hurdles? Do you see more barriers that actually should be tweaked moving forward? And how can the DoD move past that? Thank you.
Yasmin, thank you for your question. I guess I'll go first. Yes, I think it did do a lot for small businesses, right? Especially those that are only dealing with FCI. They can self-assess, right? So anything, as long as they can institute 171 practices, the 110 practices internally without utilizing an outside source, there really is no cost for them. I mean, it's all internal. The other thing it did for those at level 2 where they bifurcated it, for those that are going to be in the portion where they can self-assess, that is also cost saving for them. Remember though, as we mentioned earlier, your executives are going to have to sign off. And before, most people think, we reverted back to where we were 2 years ago because everybody can self-assess again. That's not the case, because the False Claims Act is coming into play and they plan on utilizing that to hold organizations accountable. That is something they never really did before. So with that in play, the CMMC practices, and I think the original design of Katie Arrington and the team when they first came out with this, are still pretty much in play. This also, when they, as I mentioned, 800-171 is really a worldwide framework that most folks follow. So it makes it easy to do the memorandum of agreements with those foreign countries. So in my opinion, yes, I think it did alleviate a lot of costs for the smaller businesses. Remember, all the C3PAOs, all 5 of us are small businesses, right? So unlike the contractors or the organizations bidding on contracts, we can't recoup the funds that we've put into this. So for a small organization, it just depends on how, how much do you want to get that contract? Is that going to be a big part of your business? And if that is, then you need to take the efforts now. So again, cost saving, yes, I think it did a lot. Do I think we went back to where we were 2 years ago? I don't think so.
Thank you.
Thomas, Greg, anybody? Great question, Yasmin. Thank you.
I agree with you, Rob. I don't really have anything to add.
All right, I'm going to just throw up one last slide because that's what we do at webinars. We always share slides, but I just want to share this last slide. That has your information for Redspin, how people can follow up with you. Redspin for Thomas, it's thomas.graham@synergistic.com. Robert is robert.teague@synergistic.com, and Synergistic is CYNERGISTEK. And Greg is greg@prevail.com. Thank you to our wonderful audience. Thank you to our speakers, Thomas, Robert, and Greg. It's been a pleasure having you. And this webinar has been recorded, so you guys will all get a link to it tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.